A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Shabbos at the Skitzar.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Talmud Pletzl. Whoever heard such beautiful words? Talmud Pletzl.
It is never with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is a Tourbites episode about some tour places we go to. We'll do it about Paris, and if we have time, then about the other parts of France as well. If not, then we'll just limit it to Paris. We'll see how it goes. I'll tell you how this, let me share how this episode came to be. I think it was around a year ago, maybe a little less than a year ago, a little more, something like that. I mentioned on an episode about the Jewish history in Metz, France. I mentioned that I have never had a tour to France despite all the Jewish history potential there. And at the end, now it's September, so it's after a long spring and summer of many, many beautiful, wonderful tours. I'm happy to announce that I just finished my 4th trip there this year. So, all with wonderful groups, including the most recent one was a wonderful Daf Yomi Shir in New York City. We made a siyum on Seder Nezikin of the Daf Yomi, really special Chabura, really, really great people. But all the trips this summer in general, and all the trips to France this year. So I guess my announcement on the podcast worked, because going from 0 to having 4 in 1 year, and it's gotten to a point where my wife tells me not to buy any more Damiel chocolates since we already have enough in the house. And you know that you're in Paris too often when that happens. So since this is now becoming a hot tour, and other shuls and families and everyone is starting to go to Jewish history in Paris and the rest of France as well, so I thought I'd do a Tourbites episode. I'd summarize a few of the main highlights and stops and detail of a few of the surprising findings related to Jewish history that we do there, especially in Paris itself. On one hand, I think that everyone recognizes that there's plenty of Jewish history in, like, Eastern France, that Rashi was in France, and the Balei Tosfos were in France, the Rabbeinu Tam, the Rashbam, and then if we go even further east to the areas, very heavily Jewish areas near the German border, known as Alsace-Lorraine, are loaded with Jewish history. But what about Paris itself? Is Paris just because you land there in the airport? So it's the venue. There's, of course, all the general tourist sites, like the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre. In fact, actually, I did bring a family to the Louvre, and I made it related to Jewish history as well. We haven't, since the Louvre and the British Museum in London are the greatest places of theft in the world, colonialism, where they just stole everything from Africa and Asia and the Middle East and everywhere else and brought it to these European colonial capitals to display everyone else's culture there. So they have, in the Louvre, they have these massive, beautiful pieces from Achashverosh's palace, presumably from the grand banquet hall where the great banquet of the Megillah story was. So, like, that's heavy Jewish history right there. So I made sure we did that exhibit. But obviously, the Louvre is not the most part of Jewish history, and Eiffel Tower, all these other places, and so why are we going to Paris? What Jewish history is there in Paris? Well, there's great kosher restaurants, of course, great food, but there's much more than that. There's lots of Jewish history to be explored there as well, and Jewish present. Certainly, it's the third largest Jewish community in the world after Israel and the United States is France. There's lots of shuls and yeshivas and kollels and, like I said, kosher restaurants and supermarkets and everything else. Vibrant Jewish life in the present. But we're going there to explore a little bit of Jewish history. Right in the outskirts of Paris, we have the Drancy transit camp, which was where the Jews of France, Paris, and the surrounding areas were taken by the German occupiers and their French collaborators to Drancy. They're rounded up and brought to Drancy, this transit camp, and then deported from there to Auschwitz, Sobibor, and other camps in the east, where much of French Jewry was exterminated during the Nazi occupation during World War II. So that's certainly a stop. But we delve into much more rich Jewish history as well. Another tragic place we visit is the Place Hotel de Ville, which I'm for sure mispronouncing, and I'll just put this disclaimer out there, as I generally do, that there has never been a French word that I've ever pronounced correctly, and I don't think I ever will. So I still try. I give it a shot each time, but I definitely don't. I just can't figure it out. There's a certain science to it, and I guess my ear isn't good enough. In any event, the Place Hotel de Ville it's in the center of the city, right near the Notre Dame Cathedral, even though the Notre Dame Cathedral did not exist at the time that this event took place, but the Place Hotel de Ville did exist, and it was the old town hall in the 1200s. Today it's some sort of government building. I think last year it was used for the 2024 Paris Summer Olympics. But this is the spot, the square in front of this building, is where the burning of the Talmud took place. The infamous burning of the Talmud in 1242 by King Louis IX. That's the king that was later canonized. He was given sainthood, and St. Louis, the city, is named for this great king. So one of his biggest claims to fame was that he burned the Talmud on Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, which is, it was the 9th day of Tammuz, but that's not when they designated the Memorial Day. The Rishonim, the Balei Tosfos at that time, the great medieval scholars of the 1200s living in France who experienced it, they designated the day of the week to be a fast day, the Friday of Parshas Chukas. And this was a terrible tragedy. Think about it. It's the 1200s. This is way before there's the printing press. It precedes the printing press by over 200 years. So everything's in manuscript form. And there's this terrible decree where close to 24 wagon loads, or around 24 wagon loads of manuscripts of Shas, of Gemaras, and of all kinds of commentaries of the Balei Tosfos and others, all of, Sfarim in existence. All of Jewish life is based on the written text. We're the people of the book. And it's all burnt in this square. It was following a debate that Rabbi Chil of Paris, and 3 other great medieval scholars of the Balei Tosfos who were living in France at the time were forced into this debate with an infamous apostate. Of course, our enemies always come from within, unfortunately, as continues to be the case. And this fellow, he took on the name Nicholas Donin after he became Catholic priest, actually. And this apostate, Nicholas Donin, he slandered the Jewish Talmud to King Louis IX, to the Pope, actually, Pope Gregory the something, maybe also the 9th, I don't remember, and that the Talmud is blasphemous to the church and to Christians, and they were forced into this debate, and Rabbi Chil of Paris was the main debater, but of course he was very limited in what he was allowed to say, what he was allowed to respond. That was the nature of these medieval theological debates that Jews were unfortunately often pressed into. And meaning the outcome was decided before it even started. There was nothing to talk about. It wasn't an actual debate where they were allowed to speak. And unfortunately, the Pope decreed that the Talmud should be burnt. And King Louis IX zealously followed through with this decree. And in this square on Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas, and it's famous that at the time, the great rabbis, the great tzaddikim, they made a Shelas Chaloim, which is a Kabbalistic formula of asking the heavenly spheres, what is the reason this happened? And the answer that came back was Da Gezeras Eraisa. This is a decree from up on high, from the heavens itself, so to speak. And since that is the Targum Onkelos, that is the Aramaic translation of the first three words of that week's parsha, Zois Chukas HaTorah, Da Gezeras Eraisa, so they designated the day of the fast to be Erev Shabbos Parshas Chukas to remember this tragedy. So we actually go to that spot, which is pretty powerful. That spot is the same square till today. Another place that we go to in Paris, also in the center of the city, right near there actually, is a very quaint little, few blocks, small little narrow street neighborhood that is known by the even more quaint name, the Pletzl. And the Pletzl in Paris, literally a Yiddish word for the place, was a neighborhood, a Jewish neighborhood, a bustling Jewish neighborhood from the second half of the 1800s, the later decades of the 1800s, when Eastern European Jewish immigration, this is the great migration of Eastern European Jews, primarily from the Russian Tsarist Empire, but also from Galicia, Romania, and Eastern European Jews are getting out of Eastern Europe because of poverty and anti-Semitism and draft into the militaries, and they're looking for refuge, and almost all of them obviously make it to the United States. That's the great Jewish immigration to the United States, millions of Jews. But some ended up in other Western European countries or even other countries around the world, Argentina, Australia, South Africa, but also Western Europe, to Germany and France, and the were not very well received by the local communities in Germany and France. They were in other countries. They were known as Ostjuden, Eastern Jews, Jews who were more traditional, Jews who looked very traditional, Jews who spoke Yiddish and came with their Eastern European mannerisms. And here, the German and French and other Western European Jews were much more integrated, much more Western, much more educated, and they looked with askance at their brethren from Eastern Europe. And the Eastern European Jews weren't that keen on integrating with the French and German Jewish communities, quite frankly. So it was kind of mutual disengagement. And therefore, when the Eastern European Jews arrived in Paris, they kind of set up their own neighborhood, and this is the Pletzl. They did not integrate into the French Jewish community. They remained completely separate. They were not members of the mainstream French Jewish community, which from Napoleon's time was known as the, I'm going to mispronounce this word again, consistoire, which was the name of the, or is, I think till today, that's the name of the French Jewish community. I think it's still recognized as such. And they remain separate, and they have their own little neighborhood. And in fact, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the great founder of the Musar movement, who lived in Western Europe for the last 26 years of his life, which is a great story on its own merit, and perhaps I don't think we've had enough episodes, maybe any. You know what I'm thinking right now, just it came to me that we haven't really had episodes on Rabbi Yisrael Salanter and the founding of the Musar. I can't believe it. I can't believe it's 6.5 years into Jewish History Soundbites, and we got to do this, all right? So let's get back to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter another day. But I just will mention that the last 26 years of his life he spent in Western Europe, primarily in Germany, in what was then called Memel. Today it's in Lithuania, Klaipeda, and Königsberg, which today is in Russia, and it's known as Kaliningrad, and Berlin, Halberstadt, mostly in Germany he spent at that time. But he did spend 2 years towards the end of his life, from 1881 to 1883, literally till less than a year before he passed away, he returned to Germany. But for 2 years, towards the end of his life, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter moved to Paris, to the Pletzl, to be the rabbi of the Eastern European Jewish community. Felt that these were immigrants coming to a new land, and they did not have religious leadership, they did not have a cohesive religious community, and he wants to help them and build up the community and find a long-term rabbi. He only meant to come short-term, which he did. He only stayed there for 2 years. So he had some influence there. So it's fascinating that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, you don't really associate him with Paris, but he was there, right? And in the Pletzl, much later, half a century after Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, so the young, not yet Lubavitcher Rebbe, who is still just Rebbe Nachum Mendel Schneerson, as the son-in-law of the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rayatz, he lived in Paris, running away from the Nazis, escaping from the Nazis in 1933 from Berlin to Paris. He settles down in Paris, and he hung around the Pletzl. He davened in the Stiebels there, he gave shiurim there, and he had an influence there as well. That was actually his first stint in the Pletzl, from 1933 to 1940, when he escaped from the Nazi occupation and made it to the United States. Later on, still not as the Rebbe yet, but in 1947, he returns to Paris for a second round in the Pletzl, and he comes to escort his mother, Rebbe Zintzheim, back to the United States. Is after the war, after she was able to escape from the Soviet Union, and Lubavitcher Rebbe's father had passed away in the Soviet Union. I did an episode on him quite some time ago, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the future Lubavitcher Rebbe, escorts his mother. So he's there for another few months in the Pletzl, and once again he has an impact there. He interacts with the survivors there, and he gives shiurim, and he even has farbrengens. And again, this is when he's just the son-in-law of the Rebbe, the Rayatz. Interesting. So there's actually a few Hasidic shtiblach in the Pletzl, the main road, I guess the 13th Avenue, so to speak, through, or Malchei Yisrael, whatever your point of reference is, Collins Avenue, I don't know, whatever city you're in. So in the Pletzl is the Rue de Rassé, and again, I'm probably mispronouncing that. So number 17 was known by its Yiddish name, Zibbenson, was the Lubavitcher Stiebel, and 25 was a general Hasidic Stiebel, just a few buildings down. In fact, the future Ger Rebbe also lived in Paris in the 1940s and 50s. The Lev Simcha, Reb Simcha Bunim Alter, he lived in the Pletzl. When his brother, the Beis Yisrael, Reb Yisrael Alter, became the Rebbe upon the passing of their father, the Imrei Emes, the old Ger Rebbe. So in 1948, when he passed away, so the Lev Simcha, to move out of the way of his brother, ostensibly, also to do some business in Paris, a side reason, he moves to Paris and lives in the Pletzl, and davens at 25 at this number 25 Rue de Rassé. So you have all these future Rebbes at different times living in Paris. In fact, the current Ger Rebbe grew up in Paris, in the Pletzl. So you also have in the Pletzl the Agudas HaKehilas Shul. In fact, the rabbi of the shul in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, even beyond, I think he lived a long life, for quite some time. The rabbi for decades of the Agudas HaKehilas Shul, which was the Heimische big shul in the Pletzl, was Reb Chaim Yaakov Rattenberg, who was actually an Alta Mir from pre-war Mir in Poland, survived the war in, I think, his home country of Belgium, I think. His sister was a very famous Holocaust rescue activist, Recha Sternbuch in Switzerland. So she was a Rattenberg before she married Sternbuch. And Reb Chaim Yaakov Rattenberg was later on, this Alta Mir, was a rabbi in the Pletzl in the Agudas HaKehilas. And his son is the current rabbi. Rabbi Mordechai Rattenberg is still the rabbi there. I mean, it's continuing. It's still the main Jewish community is further out in the suburbs, other parts of the city, but not so much in the center, but you still have a little bit of a presence there. So it's interesting that the Agudas HaKehilas Shul, which survived the war, and it's the original building of the shul, but the Agudas HaKehilas Shul, when it was established, when it was built in the 1920s, right after World War I, to show how, just to illustrate how much this was an Eastern European immigrant community and not a French native Jewish community. So not a single member of the establishment French Jewish leadership attended the dedication ceremony of the new shul. Not one. Whereas, who was the chazan who did kind of like a concert or like an opening prayer for the Agudas HaKehilas Shul? Who was it? It was an import from Poland. Gershon Sirota, who was later the famous, or at that time, the famous chazan of the great synagogue in Warsaw. So they bring in a Polish chazan to be, right? So their roots are in Eastern Europe. That's how much it was. Now, the Pletzl gets another major boost in its story in Jewish history in the post-war, because after many survivors, Polish, Hungarian, other survivors of the Holocaust, are in DP camps, displaced persons camps after the war. Slowly, the American and British militaries closed down the DP camps after a few years, and not all of the survivors are able to make it right away to the United States or Israel or other countries. So they pass through Paris, from Germany to Paris, where they're awaiting the response to get their visas to their final destination. And for quite some time after the war, the 1940s and 50s, the Pletzl becomes this hub of survivors. And some of them open stores and restaurants and butchers, and they're congregating in these stiebels in the Pletzl, discussing how to get out. And are you able to apply at this embassy for a visa, for a certificate, for this, for that? And this becomes like a very, very active place for survivors rebuilding their lives in the years after the war. In fact, on this trip that I just did, when I was saying this, in the middle of the Pletzl, one of the older members of the tour from Borough Park, he says, well, actually, that's how I grew up here. I grew up in the Pletzl until I was 8 years old. My parents were survivors, and they lived here after the war until they got to the United States. There you go. Exactly an illustration of what I was saying. So we had it live on the tour. Unfortunately, the Pletzl was the site, also this kind of was like also the downturn of the Pletzl. In August 1982, there was a terrible Palestinian terrorist attack against Jews in the middle of the Pletzl, in the middle of one of the butcher shops in the Pletzl, Joe Goldenberg's butcher. And two gunmen got out of their car right in front of this butcher and tossed a couple of grenades inside, and then opened up fire with machine guns to anyone running out after the grenades exploded. They killed quite a few Jews, injuring many more, and this was probably the most terrible attack on Jewish life since the Holocaust in France. And also it marked a change. It's historic in as far as the history of terrorism is as well, Palestinian terrorism against Jews, because until this attack, Palestinian terrorist attacks had been against Israel, against Israelis even abroad, let's say like the Entebbe hijacking, or even though Entebbe they had non-Israeli Jews there also, but ostensibly, it was officially at least against Israelis, or the Olympics, the 1972 Munich Olympics was officially against Israelis, and of course plenty of terrorist attacks in Israel itself. This was the first time in August 1982 that it was targeting Jews as Jews. These were completely French Jews. They had nothing to do with Israel, nothing to do with Israelis. They were French Jews living in the Pletzl, shopping for Shabbos, nothing to do with Israel, and the Palestinian terrorists felt that this was an appropriate target for attack because they're Jewish. So that's a complete paradigm shift in how terrorist attacks would play out, and of course there have been unfortunately many since then as well. So that is the Pletzl. That's another stop that we do for Jewish history in Paris. Another one, which is one of my favorite, because you say, okay, there might be, okay, so we're going, what's their Jewish history in France? Oh, Rashi and Taisvis and in the outlying cities, and then Alsace-Lorraine and Metz and all that. Okay, fine. Okay, you say that you claim that there's even Jewish history in Paris. Fine, places like we just mentioned. But there's certainly no Kivrei Tzadikim in Paris, right? That you don't have in Paris. That you don't go to. So then I bring the group to a caver of a tzaddik in Paris too. And that's really like, oh boy, wow, we're making this into a real Eastern European trip here by even doing graves of tzaddikim in Paris. So who do we go to? We go to Rav Yosef David Zintzheim, the Yad David, the author of the Yad David. That's how he's known, and I believe that his Sfarim are well studied and popular till today. And Rav Yosef David Zintzheim, we go to in the Pierre Lachaise cemetery in the middle of Paris. It's huge. It's a massive cemetery, and it's very unique because it's officially a non-Jewish cemetery. And it has a little Jewish section in this cemetery. So you're literally walking through crosses and everything to go to this Jewish section. And there it is. And there's this rabbi. I think maybe one of the more knowledgeable listeners could correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that in the early 1800s, in the spirit of the French Revolution, of brotherhood and equality and everyone's the same, So there's no separate cemeteries anymore, and therefore we bury the Jews in the Christians in the same cemetery, and that kind of like became the law for a period of time, and therefore anyone who died during that time is buried in the cemetery, and therefore it's like a Jewish section in the cemetery. In any event, so Rav Yosef David Zintzheim was a leader of French Jewry during the time of the French Revolution and the subsequent Napoleonic era. And he's most famous for leading Napoleon's quote-unquote Sanhedrin. It wasn't really a Sanhedrin, but it was something that Napoleon called a Sanhedrin. And he navigated that by being the leader of that during a very, very challenging time. So I want to dive into Rav Yosef David Zintzheim's life for a couple of minutes, just to understand. I think I may have mentioned him briefly a few years ago in another episode about the emancipation of French Jewry, but I want to elaborate it out a little bit more because his role in the Sanhedrin and how he was viewed by others as well. So he lives from 1745 to 1812, and he was a young rabbi. He had a yeshiva for a time in Alsace. He lived in Alsace in the much more Jewish traditional area of France historically. And then later, the revolution wreaked havoc on Jewish life, just like on everything else in France. And especially during the Reign of Terror, there's this backlash against all religion. Officially, the revolution was against the Catholic religion because they were associated with the aristocracy and the French nobility, which was the revolution was against. But all religions suffered. So he, shuls were shut and yeshivas were shut and all kinds of things like that. Following the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, when things settle down, he becomes the rabbi in Strasbourg. So that's out in Lorraine. And he arises in the post-revolution era as one of the most prominent and famous religious leaders in all of France. This is the beginning of the emancipation of French Jewry. This is not a simple time. The French Jews are the first ones to be emancipated, so this is a new reality that no Jews in Europe had ever experienced, being equal citizens, equal rights, and now being expected to integrate into French society. Their autonomy is being stripped away because everyone's becoming citizens of the state at this point. So this is a really, really, completely pioneering. There's no precedent. It's unprecedented, right? There's no precedent for this reality in Europe because they're literally the first ones to be emancipated. So a few years later, he is appointed to be the head of this Sanhedrin. In 1806, and later it continues into 1807, Napoleon appoints this Jewish leaders. Now, Jewish leaders doesn't mean Jewish rabbis. It's all kinds of leaders. In fact, the majority of them were secular, lay leaders, most of them completely secular, integrated into French society. And a minority were rabbis, and an even smaller minority were rabbis of the caliber of Rav Yosef David Zintzheim, who was based at Zintzheim. I think I mispronounced it before. Zintzheim. In any event, so he's the most prominent rabbi, and he's considered the head of the group. The problem is that the Sanhedrin and even the preliminary meetings before the actual Sanhedrin convenes is democratic, and the majority are secular. The majority are not particular about traditional halacha in Jewish law and ritual, and therefore Napoleon, the reason that he convenes this this Jewish conclave, so to speak, this Jewish Sanhedrin, is because Napoleon needs answers to questions, because he says, look, the Jewish community is integrating into French society now. And I want to know, is there anything in the Jewish religion that's going to prevent them from properly integrating into society? And I have questions. I have questions about the Jewish religion and Talmudic law and Halacha. That will these things prevent you from integrating? We need everyone to be one society, citizens of the state, doing your obligations towards the state, in taxes and keeping the law and being part of the military and anything else. And we don't need this separatist movement within French society prevented by your religion from integrating properly. So Napoleon presents these questions to the Sanhedrin and expects certain types of answers. And that's going to be a challenge. And think about he's between a rock and a hard place, because Rav Yosef David Zintzheim, on one hand, he has to satisfy Napoleon. He has to, the government needs to be happy. Napoleon's not the type of guy that you want to make upset, if you know what I mean. And on the other hand, he's a minority. The majority of this Sanhedrin is secular leaders who want to integrate, who want to please Napoleon, and they don't care particularly for, ancient Orthodox religious halacha. Not even Orthodox yet. This is the beginning of Orthodoxy, right? But religious, traditional halacha. So he has the majority against him, essentially. And on the third hand, he has his own values, which he cannot compromise. He cannot compromise on what he understands to be the Torah true halacha. So, it's an amazing, underappreciated challenge that he's going through, that he basically has to navigate alone with a few other rabbis, primarily from Italy, who are along with him in this. The first challenge started even before the Sanhedrin convened, because they had a vote for the positions on the Sanhedrin, the leadership, the secretaries, and all that. They had a vote. The vote was to be cast on Shabbos. That's when the French government decided to have this vote. And he said, no, we're not voting on Shabbos. And they said, no, yes, we are. So he said, okay, maybe the religious members can cast their vote. What do they call it today? The mail-in ballots. They'll do it before Shabbos, before the date of the election, right? So he succeeded in getting that compromise. And then Napoleon presents him with 12 questions, all of them relating to a potential conflict between Jews integrating into French society. So I want to go through a few of the answers that he gave and to see the wisdom, because he wrote all the answers himself. Ultimately, he came up with it, and they were able to vote on it and agreed to his answers. But he literally, this huge Sanhedrin with the majority against him and the French government giving him all this pressure, he wrote all the answers himself. It's an amazing feat. So one of the questions was about polygamy, or bigamy, whatever you want to call it. Are Jews allowed to marry more than one wife? In French civil society post-revolution, this was very much frowned upon and illegal, so he wanted to know what Jewish law had to say about it. So Rav Yosef David Zintzheim said, they said, no, we are not allowed to, because of Cherem d'Rabbeinu Gershom, and therefore we're not allowed to marry more than one wife. The next one was about divorce. Napoleon wanted to know, does Jewish law allow to have just Jewish divorce, or does Jewish law say that you also need the French court's civil divorce from the French government? So Rabbi Yosef David Zintzheim wisely said, he came up with this brilliant answer. He said, not only do we, of course, allow the Jews to have a civil divorce, but they're required by the Torah, by Halacha, to have a civil divorce. And this is what he said. He said, and again, I don't know Hilchas Gittin, but this is what he said, okay? I'm just saying this as a historian. He said that since the Torah requires that the get, the Jewish divorce document, be a davar hakoires beinai lebeina, that it completely separates between the man and the woman by the divorce, if there's, by civil law, still recognizes them as married, that means they're still not chorus, they're still not kaires beinai lebeina, still not completely cut off between the two of them. They're still connected. How are they connected? Because the law of the land sees them connected. And if the law of the land sees them connected, so then they're still halachically not completely divorced, and therefore they need to have a civil divorce. That was his answer. The next question was the most complicated question of the entire Sanhedrin, and that was intermarriage. Napoleon wanted to know if there's anything stopping the Jews from marrying other French people. And the secular leadership on the Sanhedrin, they said, we can't tell them that the Torah does not allow it, it can't be. And Rav Yosef David Zintzheim held his ground here, and he told Napoleon the truth. He said, no, according to our Torah law, I'm sorry to disappoint you, Napoleon, but we are not allowed to marry, not allowed to intermarry. But this was his one compromise. He said that from now on, anyone who does intermarry will not be put in cherem. Until then, someone who intermarried was put in cherem by the Jewish community, by the Bezdin, and they had to have all this excommunication and everything that came with it. So this was his compromise. No longer would they use cherem against people who intermarried. The next question that Napoleon had was regarding universal brotherhood between citizens of the country. Is everyone who are citizens of the country, Jews and non-Jews, are they all together? Are they all in one brotherhood? Are they all responsible for one another? Are they all love each other? So, I mean, there was an expectation that Napoleon had. I don't know if any country in the world has that, regardless of Jews or not, but that's the expectation that Napoleon had in any event. And Rav Yosef David Zintzheim said, yes, of course. He said that we have the Torah requires us to love and to assist everyone in their country, to participate in the military, and to follow its laws and all that. And he says, especially since the assumption is that most non-Jews today, or all non-Jews today, maybe observe the 7 Noachide laws, the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Therefore, they're the same treatment that we do for Jews, we need to do for non-Jews. Jews are to engage in any type of commerce in the country. The Torah encourages labor and agriculture and all that. It's totally fine. That's not a problem. And the same thing regarding another question of Napoleon, which was about observing the laws of the country. And he said, yes, of course. Rav Yosef David Zintzheim's response was, yes, the Torah requires that we observe all the laws of the Constitution and laws of the host country. So that wasn't a big deal either. Then he had another complicated question. What about loaning money with interest? Historically, this was a very central component of Jewish life in the Catholic world, that Catholics were not allowed to loan Catholics money. Jews were. Not only that, but Jews were not allowed to engage in almost any other profession because they weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to be in the guilds and the craftsmen. And one of the only options open to them throughout the medieval era was money lending and later banking. So here, Napoleon's saying, okay, well, now we're in the modern era. Now you're integrated into society. Are you going to take interest? So he says, Rav Yosef David Zintzheim's answer was that the Torah does allow us to take interest from non-Jews, but that is because non-Jews were taking interest from us. So he said, so you know what? So we'll say it like this. There is no difference between Jews and non-Jews regarding interest, and we won't take interest from non-Jews either. That was really his answer. Fascinating answer. And apparently Napoleon was quite satisfied. So he succeeded, beyond to be in such a tough spot, and he was able to navigate without compromising on the Torah or tradition. He was able to navigate the first challenge of emancipation of Jews, religious Jewry and Torah Jewry in the modern era. He literally was the first, before any Chassam Sofer or Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, or later on Bishol Salanter, I don't know, many others, so many great leaders who faced up to the challenges of the modern era. This, I don't think he's forgotten, but he's less well known than the others, and he was the pioneering one. Following this, I guess Napoleon was really impressed with him. So when Napoleon established the official Jewish community, the consistoire, so he was appointed to the chief rabbinate of the entire France. He moved to Paris from Strasbourg, and he became the chief rabbi of Paris, or the chief rabbi of France, and he passed away in 1812 and is buried in Paris, and we visit his gravesite and we speak about all the things I'm speaking about. I just want to end off with a hesped. After he passed away in 1812, on the Shloshim, the 30th day of his passing, there Chassam Sofer himself, the leader of orthodoxy in the modern era, almost the inventor of orthodoxy in the modern era, with the Chassam Sofer, the great fighter for tradition, the great fighter for religious Torah life, he delivered a hesped, a eulogy for Rav Yosef David Zintzheim. And I want to quote one passage from this hesped, because it really gives an insight about how the younger rabbis who were fighting this battle, who were confronting the challenges of emancipation, of modernity, of integration into non-Jewish societies, all the challenges, the external challenges of the modern era, how did they view Rav Yosef David Zintzheim? How did they look at him as this pioneering leader who, he was their precedent. He had no precedent. He had to invent the wheel, so to speak. And he becomes the role model for people like the Chassam Sofer. So I'm going to quote one passage of his Hesped, obviously translated to English, even though I asked ChatGPT to translate it, but I looked it over and I made sure that I did it. He did it. I don't know if ChatGPT is gendered. If it did a good job as translating, so this is a pretty accurate translation. Such indeed was this righteous man whose eulogy we are delivering, the esteemed and brilliant Reb David Zintzheim Zatzal, author of the Yad David. While he held an honored and very close position with the royal court in Paris and was consulted on various matters to which he responded with wisdom, and he was greatly respected and esteemed in the eyes of the king and his ministers, and, as is known, great honor was accorded to him upon his passing, nevertheless, he remained a great man for the Jewish people as well. He devoted all his days to Torah study and completed the Talmud several times. All the works of the Rishonim and Achronim were truly fluent on his lips, as is evident from his writings. I knew him in my youth, and even now through correspondence with him, and I have seen his righteousness and integrity. It turns out that, in addition to becoming a leader through his wisdom in civil and political matters, he remained a ruler through his own strength. They did not rule over him, nor did he follow after them, God forbid. Rather, after revealing to them a bit, he would then hide from them even more. His integrity remained intact, and his fragrance was not diminished. Beautiful, poetic Hesped of the Chassam Sofer about Rav Yosef David Zintzheim. So, we speak about a lot of other things in Paris. We speak about the expulsion of Jews from France in 1306 and how they returned eventually. We speak about later on Jewish life in Paris. There was another famous rabbi later on in the 19th century, of Tzadok Khan. In fact, Paris also had a Jewish prime minister, Jewish socialist prime minister. I think 3 short stints. Leon Blum. We mention also the Alliance, Alliance Israelite Universelle, the Kol Yisrael Chaverim organization, Adolphe Cremieux, who headed the Alliance, founded the Alliance, and others. And of course we speak about the Dreyfus trial and all that. There's loads to speak about in Jewish Paris and the post-war immigration of Algerian and Moroccan Jews to Paris and France, and how Sephardic Jews from Morocco and Algeria constitute the majority of French Jewry today. And with that, there's the post-war story, fascinating story of Reb Gershon Liebman, a student of Novardok who survives the Holocaust and settles down in France and starts a Novardok yeshiva network among Moroccan Sephardim, Sephardic Jews. So where Novardok does not succeed in rebuilding in Israel and the United States after the war, it does succeed in France, ironically, of all places. Not just of all places, in France with Sephardic Jews. And there's this network of yeshivas and kollel, all of whom adhere to the Novardok education of Reb Gershon Liebman and his students, which is a fascinating story in its own merit. We didn't get to the rest of France. We'll have to do another France Tourbites of the countryside, of where Rashi lived and the Bali Taisis lived, Strasbourg and all that. That we'll have to save for another time. Looking forward to taking all of you on trips with your shul, with your family, with your group, with your community, whatever it is, to France or to any other country in the world with Jewish history. Be in touch with me. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com. For questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures, you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform. Leave a 5-star rating and a review if you can. If you also would like to help the podcast out by telling your friends and family about it. And I hope you enjoyed.